Before my wife passed, we had decided we'd have a big family. One we could always love and cherish and always be there for. At the time, we hadn't realized the gravity of our decision and how much it would change our lives. But to this day, I have no regrets. We couldn't conceive naturally, so we had adopted. The thing about having children, whether of biological relation or not, is that you have no idea what you'll get. Sure, with blood, you can determine what percentage of your genetics will be passed down, and can likely assume race, eye color, hair color, etc. about the child based on you and your partner. But that child's personality and everything about them is unique to them. Yet, my wife had looked at her kids and just knew. She knew all of her daughters, knew her son, and had insisted on adopting every single one of them. She knew exactly who she was taking home, and she cherished them so deeply. This is why it hadn't been surprising to hear that her spirit had remained to watch over us. Or, at least, that was what we had originally thought. For introduction, I would like to tell you about my children. My wife and I had 5 beautiful kids. The eldest was Anita, who was 17 at the time. Following her were the twins, Delaney and Daria, at 15. Our youngest was 9, and her name was Lydia. And at 12, my only son was Kaisuke. Because half of my children were born of different cultures, speaking different languages than I had made sure I was able to speak to them, both in their native tongue as well as in English. My wife and I had learned Mandarin Chinese for Anita and Japanese for Kaisuke. Though they rarely spoke their languages at the time, I had kept up with grammar and practice just in case. Which is why, at first, it had shocked me when Kaisuke had come to me and said, "Yore ge aru." There is a ghost. At the time, we had recently moved. My wife had been killed in the city, accidentally shot in a drive-by while walking to the parking garage after work. I hadn't wanted our children to remain there, to remain in the home that she had stayed in, and to live in the very city she had been murdered in. So, I took us to my hometown in the middle of the rural Midwest. Real estate is far cheaper here, and my job is quite versatile, so it had been relatively easy to make happen. Only a week into the move into the new house had Kaisuke informed me of the ghost. I had looked at him and had asked, "Doko ka?" Where? "Soko," he had said, pointing upstairs. "Over there." "Dere?" I had asked. "Who?" And Kaisuke had said, "Haha, Mum." It hadn't been abnormal for Kaisuke to get lost in the grief. My children all mourned in their own ways, of course, and my son had often taken to talking about my wife as if she was still here with us, right next to us. Whether at the dinner table, or in the car, or out and about, he had acted as if his mother was alive. I had entertained him at the time. "Well," I had switched over to English, "I'm sure she just wants to say hi to you." Kaisuke had stuck to Japanese. "Nihongo o hanasenai." That had sent a chill of fear down my spine, for some reason. Hearing my 12-year-old monotonously say she can't speak Japanese made me nervous. Because if my son were talking to her ghost, why hadn't she been able to understand the language she had taken years to learn just for him? It was then that I realized what my son was getting at. So I had told him, "Haha, Janai. That's not Mum." Kaisuke had nodded. Now, I believe in ghosts. As a child, I had experienced my fair share of oddities, and during my college years, I had been a self-proclaimed amateur investigator of the paranormal. While I had never seen anything, even to this very day, I had witnessed lights turning on or off, heard footsteps and voices, and had once gotten touched, despite nobody being behind me. Who was I to say that my son wasn't seeing his mother, or rather, someone who looked like his mother? Months had passed. Keisuke had told me, always in Japanese, about the woman upstairs that looked like Mum, acted like Mum, sounded like Mum, but wasn't able to speak Japanese or Mandarin Chinese. He had told me she was kind, that she was watching over us, that she saw everything we did. Yet, that hadn't been a comfort. Not at all. It was something in late July, soon before the new school year, when I had woken to Keisuke screaming. My son often had nightmares. Even now, in his 30s, the kid has an active imagination that sometimes gets the better of him. And so I had assumed, mid-run into his room, that it had been just that, a nightmare. That was all. A nightmare wouldn't tug on a child's leg though. Leg, blanket, and even the mattress, all jerking downwards at once, as if something had a hold on his ankle and was trying to drag him away. Keisuke had grabbed at the sheets, and I had grabbed him, yanking him up into my arms without thought. There had been no resistance when I had done so. I remember thinking, while crossing his room and walking out into the hall, that whatever had been pulling him would trip us on our way. But nothing had. I carried Keisuke, a sobbing, shaking mess, into my room, telling his sisters to go back to bed, that everything's fine, go back to bed. I don't think either of us got any more sleep that night. It had happened again about a week later, and again. I don't recall to what frequency, but just that. For months, we had both lost so much sleep to the fear of it happening. I had switched his room with mine, had him sleeping downstairs rather than up, had moved him and Anita into the same room, and still it happened. Only when he was alone, though. "What does she want?" I had asked him one day while we were out at the grocery store. He had made some sort of vague gesture and said something along the lines of, "Not sure." "Have you told her to stop?" I asked. Keisuke assured me. I told them to, but they won't. They, implying more than one. When I had inquired about that, Keisuke had told me that there were multiple not mums. They would stand around his bed, one or multiple, pulling, several watching. When I had finally asked how many are there, Keisuke had gotten quiet. He hadn't looked at me in the eye, was silent the whole drive back. Only when we had pulled into the driveway did he say. At first there was just one. Now, there's 9. He had been staring at the house, not moving, not unbuckling his belt. So I asked, safely in Japanese, "Kaiga shitiete?" Have you been hurt? No. It didn't matter. The look in his eyes told me we had to leave. Those not mums must have known, though, because as soon as I began looking for new, affordable places, things got so much worse, so much faster. Anita had seen him getting tugged in their shared room, both during the day and at night. His sisters had told me about when they were home alone. He would jerk backwards or stumble as if something had grabbed his shoulder or had tripped him. And I had witnessed things before being thrown his way. Clothes, toys, books, dishware. I had even caught a heavy can of paint before it could crack open on his head. It had been up on a shelf, completely void of the ledge. Things would always fall. Items of his would always go missing. And every goddamn night they would grab for him. The one time the not mums had been successful was the last time we had been in the house. Keisuke had taken to sleeping in my room. We had gone to extreme measures, chaining him to the headboard, loosely, not enough to cut circulation or keep his wrist above his head, but merely to keep him from being dragged too far, tying the blankets down at the end. And it had seemed to work. The blankets would pull, his feet would jerk, but he would go nowhere. I underestimated the knot mums. They learned how to unlock the strap around his wrist. I had woken up to his shrieking. An invisible force yanked him sideways, foregoing his legs and pulling him head first to the floor. It was the farthest these things had gotten him, and they didn't relent. I scrambled out of bed and grabbed him, just before he could be dragged out into the hallway. With my feet planted on either side of the doorway, I had hugged him close and prayed it would release him. We had heard the footsteps only a second later. Fast, far too fast to be human, skittering across the hallway rug, against the drywall, on the ceiling. A disembodied high-pitched chortle followed. When Anita had thrown open her door all the way at the end of the hall, something had slammed it shut in her face. She had only just managed to avoid getting her fingers smashed. The twins had been crying in their room, yelling out, "What was that?" and "It's in here," and "Go away," through their sobs. I had curled over Keisuke, but something still fought me as I felt a lung-crushing pressure against my back, and something had been trying to force my chin up and away from where it had been tucked against the crown of my son's head. Luckily, Lydia had been untouched and perfectly fine. Keisuke's head had been bleeding. To this day, he has a scar from where his forehead had clipped against the edge of the bed frame, a short, thick rope of scar tissue against his hairline. When I had gotten to my feet, I had made sure to drag Keisuke upright with me. He had been shaking and silent, likely scared shitless, and I just couldn't do it anymore. We had packed bags for a few days in a hotel and left only an hour later. I had stayed with Keisuke the entire time. It took me mere days to find an apartment and negotiate moving in. The damn thing had been cramped, and all my kids had to share a room, while I shoved our stuff into storage. But we had made it work until I could afford a different place. I also got a friend of mine, a very spiritual woman, to get her friend to put protection on him. She told me that my late wife had been protecting him all along, but now he was vulnerable. I hope that protection is still sturdy in place. Even though it's been about 2 decades, Keisuke tells me he remembers it clear as day. Only a few months ago, when we had all gathered to celebrate 4th of July together, he had told me. Oh yeah, I remember that. Anita had shared with us her experience of sleeping in the same room as Keisuke. She had told us that she had seen something sometimes. At first, she had thought it was her imagination, since it had always been in the middle of the night when she had woken mid-dream. But when she had described it, Keisuke had shot up and agreed. According to them, it had looked like their mother head-on. It had her long black hair, her round face, her smile. But Anita had said that when it wasn't looking at her, it had bulging eyes, as if they had been just stuck on top of another pair, so she says, and its face was caved in without a nose, as if it had been cleaved down the middle. Forgive the possible graphic image. Anita is a horror poet. It was only then, a few months ago, on the 4th of July, that I remembered how Keisuke's mother had died. The woman had him in her custody when he was only a toddler, had been solemn as she said. The poor girl shot herself. She didn't die right away though. She just put the gun under her chin and pulled the trigger, apparently. Keisuke's mother had been British, if I recall correctly. A British woman who had married a Japanese man. But that's all I know. I won't be telling my son this. After all, He doesn't need to know that the woman who had given birth to him was wearing his mother's face over her mutilated one, just to haunt him. The thought that her caved-in, horrifying face could always be lurking right over his shoulder is terrifying to me. Apparently, both Anita and Kaisuke have gone back to that house, abandoned since we had left, unfortunately, and have said they had experiences. And when I had asked Kaisuke recently about anything supernatural happening, he had said, well, no weirder than anything before.
Hello listeners, if you enjoyed this story, please check out the author in the description. For more content, leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more sinister readings.